Chapter 55, Transportation, Section 4. The convicts first sent to New Holland entered on the voyage with dread. The letters they addressed to their friends while the fleet lay at anchor were examined by the officers. They were filled with lamentations. They deeply deplored that the distance of their exile cut off the hope of return. The perils of so long a voyage alone seemed frightful. Should they reach the shores of New Holland, they expected to be destroyed by savages or to pine away in want. The females seemed least to fear their banishment, and while several of the men were deeply moved, a spectator who curiously remarked the mental influence of their prospects saw only one woman weep. When the ocean had often been traversed by convict ships, these vague terrors declined, but the order, comfort, and security which now prevail were little known. The freight was of such importance that the masters were tempted to defraud the prisoners of water, and even of food, confiding in their means to silence or compensate the sufferers when in sight of port, or to satisfy the government. So slightly considered was this species of fraud, or so useful to colonial traders, that the magistrates held the payment of a gratuity to be a bar to further inquiry. The convicts were thus exposed to severe and even dangerous privations. Scurvy, a malady often in those days fatal to half a ship's crew, broke down the strength of men, emaciated, dispirited, and diseased. Many perished by the way, and a much larger number arrived unfit for labor and a public burden. The management of a convict ship legally vested in the captain, his duty contemplating nothing more than a safe arrival. The personal government of the prisoners was confided to the surgeon, subject, however, to the discipline of the ship, of which the captain was exclusive judge. The health of the company was often sacrificed to the security of the vessel. The prisoners suspected of piratical intentions were battened down and forbidden exercise, lest they should rise upon the crew. From the first, the officers in charge claimed a right to inflict corporal punishment, but up to 1823, without the sanction of law. By the act then passed, power to order punishment was confided to the surgeon superintendent, with the concurrence of the captain, who was entrusted with a veto and was bound to enter his assent in the logbook, with the nature of the offence and extent of the infliction. Apprehensions of mutiny were much more common when transportation to New Holland was recent than experience has justified. On the slightest alarm, the prisoners were loaded with chains, fastened to ring-bolts attached to the ship's sides. Perhaps no vessel ever crossed the line without some plot, rumoured or real, but the most ordinary precautions have been found usually sufficient to detect and explode them. Their inventors have often been their discoverers. The prisoners, commonly distrustful of each other, shrank from the confidence required to plan and execute a revolt. But when timid officers were in charge, they sometimes adopted restrictions severely oppressive, and which men of more courage and experience perceived to be needless. During the war, the deportation of prisoners was attended with special difficulties. No ship's company were less likely to support the flag of their country. They were often delayed until a convoy could attend them. These hindrances were frequent when this colony was founded. Both male and female prisoners were commonly forwarded together. The officers and soldiers selected companions for the voyage, and a sentence of transportation included prostitution. It is not incredible that modest women rejected life on such terms, or preferred a public execution to the ignominy of a floating brothel. These practices were first tolerated as inevitable and afterwards justified as politic. No conspiracy could be concealed, while the women were paramours and spies, and, when long detained, the population of the ship considerably augmented before she dropped anchor. The government of the vessel was not less severe than its aspect was licentious. Thus, the abuses which, during the war, penetrated every branch of public business rioted in the convict ship, whilst the contractors, who engaged to convey the prisoners at a price, snatched a profit from the subsistence stipulated by the Crown. Malignant fevers, brought from the hulks or prisons, propagated in the stagnant atmosphere, and, when combined with low and crude diet, more than decimated the list. These effects of official negligence were early apparent. The Second Fleet lost nearly 1/5 of the whole, either on the voyage or shortly after the arrival. Of the previous expedition, the loss was trifling. It was fitted out with integrity, surpassing the custom of the times, or the pioneers of the colony might have perished on a barren shore. Captain Parker of HMS Gordon detected this peculation. He traced the unusual mortality to the frauds of the officers, whose subduction from the standard allowance had starved the prisoners to death. But it was not till many years after that the humanity of ministers interposed effectual regulations. The numbers who perished on board the General Hewitt, the Surrey, and the 3Bs in 1814 forced the attention of the local government to the subject. And on the report of Surgeon Redfern, great improvements were adopted. The dispatch of vessels, without regard to the season, brought the prisoners within the cold latitudes and exposed them to the southern winds in the winter. And thinly clad and enervated by the heat of the tropics, they were crowded below or shivering on the deck. A supply of warm clothing and the choice of the proper period of sailing greatly mitigated the voyage, and the constant examination of the diet, samples of which were preserved, checked the avarice which cost so many lives and had thus led to atrocious crimes. It is humiliating to find at every step the traces of wrong. The comforts supplied the prisoners by their friends were often stolen by the seamen. The pledges lodged in their hands were not restored. Boxes were pillaged, and the trifles furnished by the self-sacrifice of a broken-hearted parent became the spoil of the assignees of public vengeance. These evils were aggravated by the delay of the voyage to subserve the commercial speculations of the surgeons, who, beyond the general gains of merchandise, were allowed a large remission of the customs. Dr. Bromley, who superintended the transit of prisoners on several occasions during the first quarter of the century, availed himself largely of these trading privileges. Thus, he landed, free of duty, at the close of one voyage, 150 gallons of spirits, 1 hogshead of wine, and 10 baskets of tobacco, beside a shipload of women. This profitable form of investment excited no local complaint and implied no disgrace. The female convict ships continued under the same system of management until some flagrant instances induced the Board of Admiralty to check the grossness of vice. Of vessels remembered for their pollution, the Friendship and Janus are distinguished. The keys of the prison were accessible during the night. The conspiracy reached from the cabin to forecastle. The officers were libertines themselves, or even when their conduct was least equivocal, it was difficult to obstruct irregularities. Not even bars and bolts resisted the ingress of forbidden guests. The wooden barriers which covered the entrance were displaced by some traitress within, who left no protection to her companions but the point of honor. The first who improved the discipline of the convict ships were Captain Brown and Dr. Reed of the Morley. They endeavored, by precept and example, to inculcate morality. Coercion had been found ineffectual, and the women, when restricted, filled the vessel with clamor and profaneness. But these gentlemen adopted a system of mental influence, and their prisoners, whatever was their subsequent conduct, were far superior to their predecessors. The result of this instance led to a permanent amelioration and proved what had hitherto been doubted, that even the worst societies can be controlled by those who unite a sense of virtue with official authority. The safety ascribed to the system of prostitution was but an apology for vice, and the voyage of the Jane Shore dissolved the illusion. The persuasion of the women accomplished what the male prisoners rarely attempted, and when on their passage to the colonies have never been able to effect. The soldiers and sailors, seduced by their caresses, seized the vessel, and having shot the captain and the chief officer, steered into a South American port. Once only did a piratical plot assume a serious form. The prisoners by the chapman devised a capture, but the report of the design being communicated, the guard was prepared for resistance. A deadly fire covered the deck with carnage. Several were precipitated into the sea. The sanguinary conflict, which might have been prevented by timely precautions, obtained for the chapman the popular prefix by which it is distinguished. On one occasion, a vessel was in imminent danger through the foolish incaution of the guard. It was the custom to discharge the firearms at sunrise and to load them at noon. The interval seemed to offer the fairest prospect of success, and the prisoners extensively joined in the conspiracy. But they were overheard in conversation by a soldier standing at the hatchway. The ringleaders were seized, and the plot defeated. During the shorter voyages from port to port, such accidents have been much more common, although rarely successful. Knatchbull, a relative of the eminent Kentish family and formerly an officer in the navy, enticed his fellow prisoners to attempt the capture of the vessel which conveyed them. But his device to poison all but the conspirators with arsenic was denounced. The prisoners sent down from Sydney to Van Diemen's Land were conveyed in small crafts and small numbers, and without much regard to their health. But as an example of wretchedness, nothing could exceed the usual passage from Hobart Town to Macquarie Harbour. The unhappy men, often destitute of clothing, were placed in the hold of a vessel, without bedding or blankets, and were exposed, sometimes for 5 or 6 weeks, to the chills of a wintry voyage. On one such, there were 35 men who had but 4 blankets among them, and one was found without any other covering than his shirt, in which plight he had been forwarded from the jail. The surgeon superintendent enters on his office at the same moment with the guard. His duties are multiform: the magistrate, the chaplain, the mentor, and the physician. The surgeons are usually popular with the prisoners, and the penal administration with which they are entrusted is generally the most disguised. Educated men, they are not commonly haughty and capricious. They are able to distinguish moral imbecility from perverseness, and both from disease. The habit of scrutinizing quickens their sagacity and fits them for a station where the knowledge of the heart is the great secret of control. Accustomed to beholding human nature, stripped of all its external trappings, the grade of the prisoner, in their estimation, does not wholly debase the man. Witnesses to the wretchedness of humble life, the squalor of its garrets and its cellars. Observant that want, which sometimes forms the felon, much oftener makes the martyr, and crowds the hospital rather than the jail. They are not incapable of pitying either class of victims. The horrors which others feel for disease, whether of the body or the mind, excite no antipathies in men who have devoted their lives to its relief. Thus, their government of convicts often affords a singular contrast to the agency which precedes or follows them. The recollection of their conduct is mentioned by the prisoner with respect, and even with fondness. No profession can better prepare for practical benevolence. What it withdraws from the sensibility it adds to the understanding. And those in charge of convict vessels have exhibited in full average the virtues of their profession. When physical suffering became infrequent and the arrangements secured both convenience and comfort during the voyage, it was long ere moral control or a reformatory discipline became objects of concern. A surgeon employed from 1818 amused the public with the details of his system of management. Not wanting in humanity, he encouraged a joyous indifference to the past or the future. The prisoners sang from morning to night and often spent the evenings in dancing. The greatest criminals were selected on principle for offices of trust, as far the most trusty. The discourse was licentious. The feats of thievery, the chosen topics of amusement and conversation. A stage, decked out with the remains of former spoil, exhibited the 40 thieves, or a comedy of judges, officers, and felons. Mock charges were enforced by barristers, arrayed in blankets. The bench was filled with an actor decorated with a quilt, while a swab covered his head and descended to his shoulders. In the female prison ships, dancing and concerts, at which the cabin passengers were spectators, whiled away the voyage. The gross immoralities of a former period had subsided when he wrote. He mentioned the change with regret. A free intercourse, he thought, more conducive to reformation as well as to harmony. The attachment formed by the women softened their demeanor and facilitated their control. Such were his views, and they had many partisans. But in connection we learn, without astonishment, that he thought contemptuously of saintship, considered reformation utopian, and honesty rather the result of habit than of principle. The convicts, more unfortunate in their detection than peculiar in their crimes, capable of the devotion of hypocrites, hardly of repentance, the dash of libertinism which sparkles in the pages of this writer, fell in with the humor of the day, and the work was popular. It greatly tended, notwithstanding its levity, to change the character of penal discipline in the colonies. The discipline of a convict vessel, as administered by Surgeon Superintendent Browning, exhibited a different scene, and was carried out in another spirit. The devout character of his mind, his confiding disposition, and boundless goodwill are well known in these colonies, and his management has been regarded with great admiration or great contempt. His high valuation of human nature contrasted with the common official estimate. He not only saw fellow men in the worst prisoners, but practicable materials, which knowledge and judgment might form into comparative moral excellence. The plan of his government recognized a wide distribution of oversight and responsibility. The names by which he distinguished those whom he employed were flattering. They were not jailers and turnkeys, but captains of divisions and delegates. He delivered lectures upon geography and astronomy. Those who could play instruments, such as clarinet, fife, and violin, were stationed on the deck. While the rest marched in ranks, he instituted a court of inquiry, consisting of 5 persons, of which his clerk was the recorder, who examined witnesses and disposed of trivial offences by exhortation, warning, and reproof. And in more flagrant cases, these preliminary inquiries formed the basis of his own adjudication. He treated the prisoners as persons sequestered from society for their own good. He has shown, by tables, that those who acquired a knowledge of reading under his instruction, often indeed imperfect, formed a large proportion of the whole. His addresses exhibit the ardour of his character. Most critics would discern a tinge of enthusiasm, which, however, is common to all who successfully attempt the reformation of mankind. Under such a guardian, it may be imagined that the physical welfare of the prisoners was carefully superintended. Medical comforts were distributed with great liberality. Flogging was wholly disused. Moral influence, assisted by occasional deprivation of food or liberty, comprehended the agency he employed. The systems of Browning and Cunningham, though contemplating the same general objects, were singularly adverse, and in nothing did they differ more pointedly than their estimate of the substrata of convict character, the influence of religious instruction, and the usefulness of the cat. Dr. Browning was subject to much imposition, a liability which meets every aspect of practical benevolence, but that he preserved order and health, discouraged blasphemy, provided for the occupation of time, and prevented gambling and speculation, that he sheltered the well-disposed from the violence and contamination of the worst, and that he parted with his charge, with their ideas increased and their moral sensibility awakened, is, with all deductions, a claim to no trifling praise. Colonel Arthur, a keen observer, mentioned the general emotion which separation occasioned. The prisoners heard his valedictory address with tenderness and reverence, and melted into tears. To reproach his labours would be a sin against mankind, but an overestimate of their effect diminished the moral weight of their example. Dr. Browning's pets became marked men. Their conduct was watched with curiosity, often with ill will, and their lapses were reckoned up with exultation. The ample provision for the accommodation, exercise, and food of the prisoners has been of late years a topic of complaint. They require more care, and a diet more nicely chosen, than labourers in health and mental tranquillity. Efforts to reduce these comforts have been followed by fever and physical prostration, and whatever aspect their treatment may wear, those who deprive them of liberty are bound to provide for their safety. The law sentences to transportation. No question of public policy could justify a minister when converting that penalty into a sentence of death. Notwithstanding the length of the voyage, the navigation of convict vessels has been fortunate. For 30 years, no vessel had been lost. The merchant ships met with the average of accidents, but the transports were supposed, by the curious, to be under a peculiar destiny. They attributed their safe passage to the force of the proverb, which implies that the trident of Neptune is powerless against the heritage of the executioner. A succession of calamities in the navigation of convict vessels changed the aspect of their fortune and filled all classes with commiseration. Such was the wreck of the Amphitrite in 1833, which struck on the coast of Boulogne. That vessel was in a position of great danger, and the French pilot, Urey, endeavoured to warn in time to save. But the risk of the usual reward, it is said, the surgeon was unwilling to incur, and the captain, not less indisposed to forfeit his bond, which included a penalty for every prisoner who might escape. Their hesitation was fatal to themselves. The women were not permitted to come on deck or to avail themselves of the opportunity to save their lives. These unfortunate females, to the number of 103, with their children, were drowned, and their naked corpses, floating to the coast of France, exhibited an appalling spectacle. The French and English mingled their tears as they beheld the bodies strewed along the beach, some models of feminine beauty, others disfigured by the recent concussions. Among the rest, a young mother, with her child clasped in her arms. Nor does it appear that the instructions of the government had ever foreseen or provided for such dangers, or authorized the temporary release of prisoners when the situation of the ship might require their liberation. The wreck of the George III in April 1835 excited the most painful sensations. Having 53 persons on the sick list, occasioned by a deficiency of proper food, Captain Moxley endeavoured to reach Hobart Town through D'Entrecasteaux's Channel. While running at an easy rate and in smooth water, the leadsman cried out, "A quarter less 4." That instant the vessel struck. At first gently, then heavily, and in less than 10 minutes she was a perfect wreck. The prisoners were below, imploring release. They rushed to the hatchway, where a corporal's guard was armed to repress them. They forced through the bars, and a few were seen to escape. The soldiers ordered to resist. Their egress then fired. The waters rushing into the hold of the vessel drowned the sick and reached the knees of the convicts, who were ascending the hatchway, and Major Ryan and the surgeon superintendent expected instant death. They succeeded in sending the longboat on shore amidst the cheers of the prisoners. Assistance was afforded by the Louisa schooner, and a party dispatched in the cutter obtained help from Hobart Town. But of 220, 133 perished. The fate of the convicts who fell at the hatchway excited great commiseration and some complaint. The officers disclaimed the order to fire, an act which could only be excused by the danger to the whole company in a rush to the boat. A board of inquiry acquitted all parties of blame. One man only was found on the wreck. An aged prisoner on his passage to the colony under his third sentence of transportation. Unable to face the surf, he lashed himself to a ring attached to the hull and there closed his career of crime. A disaster not less appalling occurred off King's Island by the wreck of the Neva in May 1835 at 4 o'clock in the morning. She struck upon the rocks, swung on the reef, and admitted the sea. The pinnace was lowered, and the prison being broken by the shock, the unfortunate women rushed on the deck. They filled the boat, which was instantly swamped, and all, except 3 seamen, perished. The longboat was then carefully laden, but being upset by the surf, all sunk, except the master and chief officer. These having regained the ship, she parted, and the women, aroused from their beds in the twilight of a wintry morning, clung shivering to the fragments. Their cries of suffering and anguish were soon hushed, and of 240, a few moments before slumbering in tranquillity, 22 only were borne on broken pieces of the ship to land. Of these, 7 died from exhaustion, and the remainder must have perished, but for the intrepid exertions of Mr. Charles Friend, who caught sight of their signals when passing the coast. 2 women disputed about the position of the vessel. Exasperated by contradiction, they were tearing each other by the hair when a wave swept them from the deck into eternity. The wreck of the Governor Phillip in 1848 was the last instance of such disasters. The vessel struck on a sandbank off Cape Barren Island, but except 4, all the prisoners were saved. 6 soldiers and 5 seamen perished, with Lieutenant Griffiths, the officer in command, a young gentleman of amiable disposition and great promise. He exhibited a brilliant example of humanity, calmness, and self-devotion. The prisoners broke from their quarters, rushed on the deck, and obstructed the exertions of the seamen. Entreating them to return, he gave them his hand and his word that he would not desert the vessel until they were clear of the wreck. While some were conveyed to the shore, he remained knocking off the irons of the rest, and then finding the boat could not regain the ship, he plunged into the sea and was last. Seen struggling with the current, the risk of life is common to the military profession, but a sacrifice so nobly made was surely not less glorious than when on the field of battle. Footnotes: the captain and each officer enjoy the right of selection. Thus, they continue the habit of concubinage until the convicts arrive at Sydney town, and some are now educating 5 or 6 children. Each sailor or soldier is permitted to attach himself to one of the females. The permission and the caresses of the artful wanton have often lured the temporary parties to marry at Plymouth, more frequently to consummate the nuptials at Sydney. Such a marriage manumits the convict. The unhappy male convicts are denied, save occasionally, these profligate liberties. Occasionally, however, they range into the quarter assigned to the women. The males, accustomed in London to indiscriminate license, discover the greatest regret at the restraint of their passions in the grossest oaths and in the grossest language. The females, who rather resemble the brutes than rational creatures in their excesses, answer their reproaches and rage with equal effrontery and unbounded impudence. It is a scene like pandemonium. A second hell, but upon the ocean. Sitting in groups, they sing, they shout, they converse in the grossest terms, corrupting and corrupted. The concubine knits or sews for her sailor near his berth. The rest wash the clothes of the male convicts. Exercise and cleanliness, conducive to their health and to the comforts of the ship. Many are remarkably neat, all are clad in different dresses. Some have been enabled to purchase caps, more have not. The males are clothed in simple uniformity, in blue trousers and a jacket. All the convicts are compelled to wash once in the day, their heads, their feet, and their faces. The men under the superintendence of a soldier, the women apart under the eye of a matron. The males are marched in a body of 6 across the deck to the pump. The sailors draw up the water, and they are artfully compelled to labour for health at the pump and to rinse away the dirt. By this prudent precaution, in every variety of weather, they obtain fresh air and avoid the scurvy or cutaneous diseases. A surgeon daily inspects this human cargo and reports its state. They are paid per head, a sum for those who survive the voyage. Hence, it is the surgeon's interest to preserve these diseased wretches. To inure this assembly, disgorged from brothels and cellars and jails, to the appearance, or to the idea of decorum, the men wash their bodies above decks, and the women between them. The sexes are forbidden to mingle, even at their meals. So rigorous a discipline is only supported by severity of punishments. Chains, tied round the body and fettered round the ankles, confine and distress each male convict by the clanking sound and by annoying the feet. This image of slavery is copied from the irons used in the slave ships in Guinea. As in these, bolts and locks are at hand, in the sides and ribs of each transport, for the vessels on this service, with peculiar propriety, are so named, to prevent the escape or preclude the movements of a convict. If he attempts to pass the sentry, he is liable to be stabbed. For the attempt, a convict was lately shot, and his executioner was applauded by his officer for a faithful though severe discharge of duty. If a felon kills his companion, a case very frequent in the quarrels of these highwaymen and robbers, the murderer is hung at the yardarm, and his body is slowly carried through the ship and launched into the deep. For the theft of provisions or of clothes from his neighbour, a case yet more common and more natural to footpads, the convict depredator is shot. For inferior crimes, as riot or quarrels, a soldier is commanded to whip the offender with martial severity. The first stroke leaves a deep impression of the wire, the second causes the blood to trickle, the third draws a stream of gore. Under several faintings, the debilitated and disordered convict receives 24 of lashes. On the slightest appearance of a mutiny, the ringleader is cast headlong into the sea, in his irons and his clothes. We commit this body to the deep, the chaplain repeals, but the words of Shakespeare, perhaps, would be more applicable. End of chapter 55, being transportation. Section 4.